Hello, I'm Rachel Babin from Oncology News Australia, proud producers of the OJC Meets podcasts. In this episode, Craig Underhill speaks candidly with Professor Sanchia Aranda. You may know Sanchia from her long-established career in cancer nursing and key leadership roles, such as the CEO of Cancer Council Australia. She is a nurse, professor, researcher, and influencer. In this episode, Sanchia shares insights from her early days when she left banking to take up nursing training. Intending to nurse burn victims, she instead found herself working alongside the witch doctor, otherwise known as the oncologist. It's a fascinating listen, charting the beginnings of the oncology specialty. We explore Sanchia's entry into academia, the taboo of friendship with patients, and her incredible work in global equity. You'll also find out why she is still a proud heretic. I hope you enjoy listening. You'll find links to the papers, bios, and Twitter handles in the notes on our website. For regular news and podcast updates, subscribe to the Oncology newsletter on oncologynews.com.au. It's free and it's a great way to support the OJC. This is Rachel Babin, and this is the Oncology Podcast.
So it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Professor Sanchia Aranda onto the OJC Meet series. Sanchia has a vast CV that we'll discuss some of the issues of that today. Her main current role is as Professor of Health Services Research at Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre in Melbourne and Melbourne University. She's on a number of boards. She has the Order of Australia Medal for contributions to cancer and nursing. It's fantastic to have you on the show, Sanchia. Welcome and thanks for agreeing to come on the show.
It's an absolute pleasure, Craig. I'm delighted to be here and join your illustrious cast of Meets speakers.
So I printed off your CV yesterday to read last night, and I just pressed print and I didn't realize it was 45 pages. It was incredible. It was wonderful to read and to see such an illustrious career in nursing and oncology. So I thought we're going to touch on a number of themes and issues today, including equity and maybe a little bit on gender bias and being a nurse in a medical world. But I think equity is something that we're going to focus on. But let's go back to the beginning and tell me how you got into nursing.
Yeah, so I left school when I was 16, went to work in a bank because that's what you did in my family. You left school, you got a job, and then you got married and had kids. And after a year in the bank, I was bored out of my brain, so I was going to go back to school and do university entrance. And my headmaster said, well, I'm the chair of the hospital board. Would you like me to see if I can get you into nursing? Obviously, the days before conflict of interest reigned. And that's what I did. And I found my tribe and my place and haven't really looked back since then.
Fantastic. So that was on the South Island of New Zealand?
Yeah, a little place. I grew up in a little town called Winton, which is on the road between Invercargill and Queenstown. But I did my nursing at Kew Hospital in Invercargill, and a 3-year hospital-based program was before the polytechnic or university programs came in. So very clinically focused and spent most of my time in surgery. So when I eventually came to Australia after I finished, I wanted to do burns nursing, and they wouldn't let me go to the burns unit because it was a surgical unit because I had to do more medicine. So I went to the unit, general medical unit that happened to have the 4 medical oncology beds. So this was 1979. So I just fell in love with oncology at that point, and it was a very different oncology world then, though. We used to draw up the chemotherapy on the bench in the treatment room, and a very different place. So it's been a really interesting journey to watch the professionalisation of medical oncology and cancer care generally over those intervening 40-odd years.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you've been really across the history of medical oncology because it really just got going in the 70s. So that was 79 when you started nursing. So that was really back in the day. It was a very new field, wasn't it?
Yeah, so in 1978, before I left Kew Hospital in Invercargill, the first medical oncologist came to Invercargill, and his name was Dr. Chevala, and I can remember that he was Eastern European, and people used to sort of talk about him in whispers when he walked through the corridors. He was treated a bit like a witch doctor, and one of his first patients actually had an extravasation in the back of their hand, and that just compounded the idea that he was doing pretty strange things to people. He treated a school friend of mine for leukemia, and she died. So that sort of, in those days, leukemia patients would have left Invercargill but for him. And so it did feel a bit weird. So I found it really interesting when I came to Melbourne, and there was far more professionalism. The medical oncologists at that point were John Sullivan and Michael Layden, and they were just starting up the unit. They had some training in the College of Physicians. We had protocols and records and set up the first day chemotherapy unit. So it was all just really beginning.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I wasn't actually that far behind you in a way. So around that time, I was a medical student, and then I did a term as second year in St Vincent's Hospital. My second year residency, I was on the oncology unit. So that was the late 80s, and it was still a new field then. And Ivor Burns and Ray Snyder had come back from the US and established an oncology unit at St V's. But, there was about 3 drugs, and it was all very new. I think they were leaders, because we'll talk about palliative care later, but they had regular liaison meetings with palliative care. They had a liaison psychiatrist who came on the ward rounds, oncology ward rounds. So, but it was all new, and it was very interesting.
Yeah, so Anne Cook was
Yes.
nurse at St Vincent's, and she recalls that Ivan and her basically set up an illegal service, an abandoned ward at St Vincent's when they started, and they just kind of cracked on and started treating patients before there'd been really any sanction.
I worked on that illegal ward. It was like a balcony that had been closed in off another ward, and they had an outpatient, couple of chairs and a couple of cubicles to see patients, and it was all being run out of there.
And they were really interesting times then. So I remember going to my first COSA meeting, which would have been just after I came back from doing the cancer nursing course at the Royal Marsden. So I did that 80-81 and came back. So it would have been either the end of 81 or 82, and was in the days, remember, when COSA everybody used to stay in the medical student quarters. That's why it's in November, because the students were all gone, and so all the participants stayed in the cheap beds, not hotels like they do now. But the guest that was the first nurse speaker for COSA, and it was a woman called Linda White, who was a nurse colposcopist at the MD Anderson Hospital. And she gave a great presentation about advanced practice nursing roles. And one of the gynae oncologists in the audience stood up and said, well, that's all very well for you to talk about it, but nurses in Australia just couldn't do that sort of role. And I remember Michael Quinn, the guy
who was Professor of Gynae Oncology, yeah.
And he stood up and he took his colleague apart and said, we have to create the space and the opportunities. And it wasn't long after that he established nurse-led PAP test training in Victoria, and I think really did pioneer the idea that nurses could have more advanced roles.
Yeah, fantastic. And then I understand you were involved in one of the first bone marrow transplants done in Melbourne. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So I was working as the nurse manager in the medical oncology ward, and we had a fellow called Ian Rochester arrived, and I'm allowed to use his name because his wife and I are still friends. And he arrived. He had 3 children aged about 6 to 2 at the time, little redheads from Mildura, country kids, country family, and had acute myelomonocytic leukemia. And he was such a nice fellow, and we gave him, terrible side effects and treatments. And he'd been referred to the unit by John Sullivan, who wasn't working there at the time, and he didn't go into remission, and he had refractory disease. And Andrew Boyd, who eventually went to Queensland, and I sat down in the treatment room after a harrowing ward round, we were thinking we were going to have to send this fellow home to die. And we said, what if we just transplanted him here? Because he'd been refused transplantation because he had refractory disease, although we had got his leukemic cell burden down. And we both looked at each other and said, why not? And honest to goodness, he'd never done transplantation. Julie Cairns, who was another oncology nurse on the ward, and I were the only two people who'd ever worked in a transplant unit. We'd both done the Marsden course. And we set about doing a chemotherapy-only transplant from a guy from Ohio State University had developed it, and high-dose melphalan without radiotherapy. And he survived another 27 years and a couple of other cancers. But the fact that he got the transplant was because he was a nice bloke. There was this sense of how innovation is not always planned. It often has to do with clinicians really wanting to do the right thing by people who they've come to care about. And Ian was certainly in that category, and he was the beginning. And from then, the Royal Melbourne made a decision to open the transplant unit, and that's when, things kind of kicked off bigger for them.
And then so you're working as a nurse unit manager, then you did a PhD in nursing. So that's how you sort of transitioned into academia, is that right?
Yeah, so I'd done a master's in advanced practice because I wanted to be a nurse practitioner, and there'd been no opportunities to do that. I moved to the Royal Children's and had a couple of years in paediatric oncology where I was a sort of an advanced practice sort of semi-educated clinician, and didn't want to stay in kids after I had my own children about that time. Couldn't work with children when you've got your own kids. I'd have never had any freedom. I'd have been diagnosing them with something nasty every 5 seconds. And Michael Green, who was a medical oncologist at the Melbourne at the time, had come back to Australia from the US, and he said, Sanchia, you need to go and do a PhD. That's what nurses who are leaders in the US are doing. And so I did. And I actually continued that sort of study. So Ian Rochester, the bone marrow transplant patient, had really got me thinking about how relationship actually leads to different decisions and impacts on what we do and for whom we do it, and a whole lot of ethical and moral dilemmas. And the close relationships were often seen as kind of taboo and not talked about. But all of us have got those stories, Craig, and I'm sure you have too. And so I did my PhD on nurse-patient friendship, actually, and had a group of nurses who had these hidden stories to tell, and explored whether or not this was an abuse of power or whether it was actually an opportunity to do some deep learning about what it is that we do. And I've subsequently, for my own sort of purposes, interviewed a few doctors about these relationships as well. And they're quite similar, but probably even more taboo than they are in nursing.
Yeah, well, you sent me one of the papers, Being Authentic and Being a Chameleon, Nurse-Patient Interaction Revisited. You wrote that with Annette Street, who some of us know as well. So we'll put some links so people can click on the link to open those papers. But so there's a whole body of work about the nurse-patient relationship.
Yeah. And that particular paper was really built on the idea that the nurses were in the group was saying that what they thought these relationships were them being authentic. But in fact, they were also telling stories about the ways in which they constantly change who they are to get the best out of the therapeutic encounter, and the way in which you actually change even your face. So I remember one of the stories that I told was about opening a wound one day, a malignant wound that was actually infected with maggots. And what you do when you take off the dressing and see that is you don't go, ugh, you actually kind of put on this face. You have a therapeutic face that you do to reduce the distress that would cause the patient. And so it's playing with those ideas about how we sometimes fall into situations as opposed to being more deliberative about how you do that.
Absolutely right there. So then became associate professor and then professor in nursing. But I see then you really, as a result of that and, your leadership, you started to get some roles internationally and got some international experience. So, and you told me off air that was really the starting of your awakening to the issue of equity. So tell us a little bit about your international experience and this theme of equity in recent years.
Yeah, so I started with some involvement in the International Society of Nurses in Cancer Care. I got asked to speak at their conference in Budapest in 1986 to give some perspectives from Australia. And that was really an awakening to the reality for nurses in low and middle income countries and the sorts of realities that they dealt with. And I spent 16 years in the end on the board of ISNCC in various capacities, with 4 as president, and really tried to do my best to shape opportunities for nurses in those countries to get better educational experiences. And that led me to an interaction with UACC, where I ultimately went on the board of that organisation. And what was exciting about that opportunity was to work more closely with both the World Health Organization and the kinds of initiatives such as things like the Essential Medicines List, and how important those lists, we might see them as just lists when we live in Australia, but actually they can make the difference between a government procuring an essential medicine or not procuring it. And so there was a lot of work while I was on the UACC board to get more chemotherapy medicines onto the list. And I see just recently that, in fact, there's now a couple of biologicals on the list. Whether they're affordable is a whole other question, but at least they are there and part of that. So while I was on the board of UACC, we supported the Mary Gospodarovich work on the Lancet Commission on access to radiotherapy. And so all of those things start to pave the way for change, help to establish the Journal of Global Oncology that Eva Segaloff is an editor on, and all of those kinds of opportunities to raise awareness. But when you start looking at the data internationally, it's very hard to see how some of that translates locally. And when I was working at Peter Mac, just after the integrated cancer services had been established, the Victorian Cancer Council published a report looking at cancer outcomes by integrated cancer service that showed that the Western and Central service had the poorest outcomes in Victoria. And so I took this paper to a strategic planning exercise at Peter Mac, and I remember an eminent oncologist said, "Oh, I don't believe the data." And I said, "What don't you believe about population level data? This is everyone who's got cancer in Victoria. It's mandatory, and this is every death." And it was that tipped me to think, well, why is this not visible? And about every 5 to 8 years, the AIHW published this data that shows that you're 37% more likely to die of your cancer if you are from a low socioeconomic group versus the highest. And we ignore it. We pretend it's to do with things that are beyond our system.
No, that's right. So, in fact, I'm going to correct you there. So the Western and Central Melbourne has the worst outcomes in Metro Melbourne.
In Metro, yes, correct.
But all of the regions are lower than that, apart from ours. So when this data was first put together, our region was amongst the worst in the state. And now we're lucky we've now matched and exceeded WECMIX, the Western Central, the best of the affluent areas of the city. And then we've got the region, but I'm sure there's heterogeneity within each region as well, because as you say, it's about the socioeconomic status. And one of the papers you sent me, you wrote when your time in the Cancer Institute New South Wales was about regional equity. We'll reference that. So, we talk about regional metro disparity. I think largely it possibly can be explained by socioeconomic factors, but we actually don't have the evidence to prove that. But
so there is an old paper from Cancer Institute New South Wales that the previous epidemiologist there, whose name is going to escape me, did, looking at whether it was regional controlling for socioeconomic status, and found that all of the difference disappeared. if you controlled for socioeconomic status. The problem is we've had terrible data, because if you look at something like Western and Central, I live in Parkville, very high socioeconomic status, versus Melton and the western suburbs, which are much lower. And so we have to get much better at being able to measure socioeconomic status. And that was what was fantastic about the work that we supported Hannah Tavonen to do when I was at the Cancer Institute, because what we did in there was we looked at cancer mortality over time by socioeconomic status. But we were able, for the first time ever in Australia, to control for extent of disease at diagnosis, because the Cancer Registry in New South Wales had been collecting registry-derived stage for 40 years. We could control for type of cancer, public-private insurance status, and age. And we were able to show that the gap between the haves and the have-nots is widening over time. And that's scary to me when you think about if you think about the idea that Australia's number one in, I think it's 7 out of the 8 international benchmarked cancers in the benchmarking program. But in fact, if you took just the high income people, we're probably way ahead, but way behind. So the gap's even bigger than it looks, I think.
Yeah, that paper was from 2017, so it's really fascinating. Again, we'll reference that. So there's still a lot to do about equity within our own country, but the international, we talk about that. I mean, it's quite stark. We have covered that Essentials Medicines list recently on the podcast, the updated list, which included pembrolizumab. So I'm not sure how many of the lower income countries will be able to afford that. But, in the setting of clear survival advantages shown in melanoma and other tumours, it is, it's appropriate that's included.
That biggest international difference, I think the starkest place is to look in paediatric oncology, whereas if you get diagnosed with a paediatric leukemia in Australia, you've sort of got an 85% plus survival, and if you get diagnosed in some parts of Africa, it's 5%. So, these are things that morally the world has to take account of.
Yeah, I agree. And if we can bring the bottom half up to the middle, if we can provide access to existing treatments, we often have a focus on new and clinical trials, but if we can provide access to existing therapies to everybody, that would make such a huge gain in the survival outcomes across the globe.
And I'm involved at the moment with a group of people that Karen Canfell has brought together through her CRE on cervical cancer to look at whether you can, in the Western Pacific, take something like cervical cancer and meet the elimination target. So, it's a great example of, there's vaccine inequities, there's screening inequities, and there's treatment inequities. But can you strategically take one cancer and start to strengthen the health system by approaching it quite systematically? And we had a treatment-related pillar conversation just last week, bringing together all the players across Australia and New Zealand who might be able to help. And I think that's the way we've got to do it. We've got to collaborate and then have targeted approaches to helping these countries to strengthen their systems.
Yeah. So it's interesting too, in the start of your career, it was about individual patient focus. And then as you moved up the ladder, it becomes more about systems change, doesn't it? And that's where the big impact can be.
Yeah, and I think that, Craig, what happened for me was that I did a lot of work on individual patients, and then what you do is you try to seek platforms where you make a difference for more people. I started doing clinical trials of support interventions and then found that I couldn't implement them. We did a randomized controlled trial looking at how best to approach preparation of patients for chemotherapy. And then when we tried to implement it in the hospital where we'd done the study, it all sort of got taken apart and the system didn't let us. So you keep looking for bigger and bigger platforms, and ultimately as you work through, certainly for me as I've worked through my career, I think you've got to tackle some of these issues from the system looking down and thinking about how you create the conditions by which more people can be helped. And I think that that's been really interesting. We had a conversation recently, yourself and Eva and Winston Lau and I, about COVID-19 and its impacts. And I think one of the things that's really struck me is the absence of care for the clinicians through COVID-19, when in fact it's clinicians that hold the systems together, not administrators, not governments. It's actually the effort of people on the ground that make it safe. And so a system level approach has to provide the conditions by which well-motivated clinicians to just get on and do their jobs.
Yeah, well said. So it can't have been easy. You've done so much, but I noticed there was maternity leave there on the CV in the middle of all that. So tell us a little about some of the challenges you must have faced as a woman and as a nurse in a medical-led world.
Yeah, so I think I've probably had it easier than some because I had good mentors. So I've mentioned Michael Green. I also need to mention Professor Dick Fox, who really came to Melbourne actually while I was off doing my master's, I think, and then I came back and he'd arrived. But he was very strongly supportive of a multidisciplinary approach. But I have had a few challenges. I remember being on the NHMRC committee with David Currow for establishing some palliative care grants. And I made some suggestions in the teleconference, and the chair of the committee turned to David and said, what do you think, David? And David said, well, I just really want to reinforce what Sanchia's just said, and added a few more things. And then the chair of the committee said, I really like what David's saying. And David and I rang each other after the meeting and said, well, what was all of that? So sometimes it's that you're not heard. Other times, being a nurse, you get dismissed.
I think there's female politicians in Australia, cabinet ministers. I think Julie Bishops tells a story about that, coming up with an idea in cabinet meeting, and it's ignored until the guy down the other end of the table says the same thing, and everyone goes, "Oh, that's a good idea." So
exactly right.
I think it's a common experience.
And I can remember once at Peter Mac when we were talking through trying to bring in a practice change, and an eminent haematologist who shall remain nameless leaned across the table and said to me, "It's all right for you. You aren't accountable for these patients." And you can imagine what I said back. So I think I haven't ever taken it lying down. But it's been interesting in my time as CEO of Cancer Council Australia. The automatic assumption for most people meeting me for the first time was that I was a doctor. So the two previous CEOs had been medical oncologists. And I usually wait to disclose. I always do disclose. I have RN on my business card very deliberately, and I've kept my registration very deliberately. But you count the measure of the person on how they react when you do disclose. And I get the full gamut from no longer being interested in talking to me right through
That's
to,
terrible.
Oh my goodness, how remarkable. Let's hear more about that. So, and everything in between.
Well, it is actually remarkable, and I think, it's a real inspiration for nurses in oncology to sort of follow some of the things that you've done. Did you ever think when you started as a nurse in Invercargill that this is where you'd be?
And I can remember when I first went into a research role, my mother said to me, she said, "Oh, it's such a shame you're not working at the bedside anymore. You're such a lovely, lovely nurse." And then she said to me, "And so what is it that you do anyway?" And I said, "Well, I mainly do research." And she said, "But it's not real research, is it? Because it doesn't save lives." And so when I wrote my PhD, I wrote it in a way that my mother would be able to read it.
Yeah, that's great. I often say when people are trying to explain a project to others, just think it like you're talking to your mum and trying to explain it.
Craig.
So, so if you're trying to think of lay kind of spin on it, because we get caught up in our super subspecialty and all the technical words. But so lessons for others, I would thought that you have lots of lessons for others. One might be that it's taking your opportunities. Clearly, you've just, you said you've been lucky and you've taken your opportunities, but that's all credit to you and your skills to be able to identify the opportunities and do that, I think. So, when you look back at change, like we talked about the change from Melbourne in the 80s and setting up the illegal service at the balcony of the ward at St Vincent's and how things have moved on. But it's not like it's a progressive change, isn't it? It's iterative. You do one thing and that works, and then you have an opportunity and you develop something else. And I think sometimes people get a bit daunted about change and new things. And what are your perspectives on that?
I think that if I had to give advice to, the future nurses out there or anybody actually, it's always take the opportunity to get a little bit out of your comfort zone. I went to a presentation once by an academic at the university talking about the glass ceiling for women, and she said one of the challenges for women is they don't apply for new roles until they're over ready. And that's in contrast to men who tend to seek to push the boundaries a little bit and know that they'll learn into it. And I think as women and as nurses, we wait too long to take those next steps. And I think you have to be brave enough. I think the other piece of advice in that is to build collaborations with people who've got different and complementary skills to you, to reach out and make those connections. The first NHMRC grant that I got with Patsy Yates, we got because it was reviewed and mentored by one of the lab researchers. And you would not think of Professor Rob Ramsey as somebody I would collaborate with, but his feedback on that presentation and his willingness to support our ambitions was unparalleled. And so be a bit brave enough to get out of your comfort zone. I know nothing about his work and he doesn't know anything about mine, but we had a shared ambition. And taking opportunities in things like organisations like COSA. I mean, COSA has been a massive opportunity for me to interact with people right across the spectrum in cancer, including people like you, Craig. And you can never underestimate how much that cross-disciplinary forum has been important for the formation of oncology in this country in a very different way than Europe. I remember going to the European meeting and the nurses were in one room and the medical oncologists were in another room, and it's not like that at COSA. We all get to interact and learn from each other, and that's very exciting.
Yeah, I wasn't aware that didn't really happen so much internationally. Yeah. What do you hope to achieve in the future? If you had a wish list of things you wanted to change or shape or influence, what do you think that could be going forward?
Yeah, so as you know, I stepped down from my full-time role last year and I've taken up a range of part-time things, and most of it centred around an equity agenda. At the moment, I'm trying to pull a group of people together to work up probably something like a synergy grant, looking at whether you can develop an equity-oriented approach to all of the work that we do. So that's important. I've taken on a role in a disability organisation as chair of the board because I think there's a whole lot of people out in this world that we don't even see from a cancer perspective, and learning about disadvantage from a whole different perspective. And then I'm doing a massive amount of mentoring. I see that part of my obligation in this part of my career is to think about the next generation and how they get supported to achieve the best they can achieve.
Fantastic. You also mentioned that you thought several moments in your life you deliberately taken on the role of being a heretic.
Yes.
Are you still a heretic? And tell us
I was a heretic last week actually when I spoke at the Consumer Forum for the VCCC, because I said, 20 years later it hasn't advanced much. We're not doing co-production. We're still at the involving and listening stage of working with consumers, and take an area like mental health where they have employed consumers and mental health services to support patients. Yeah, we're a long way from being at the tip of that. So that's one area.
And how did that go down?
I think it went down really well with the consumers. A little bit, the people who are trying their best to get stuff happening feel a little bit defensive about it. But I think it was a good conversation. But sometimes that has being a heretic has unsettled my colleagues. I remember when we moved in New South Wales from funding nurse coordinator roles to funding coordination indicators, to say, because we were never at the Cancer Institute going to be able to afford to fund as many care coordinators as are needed in the system. And we needed something that said to the hospital, you've got to start taking this on as a regular thing. And I was seen as kind of turning my back on nurses, which was challenging, but okay. I had a couple of pretty challenging emails, but we need the system to change, not to fund the individuals. And the other area where in advanced practice, where I'm still being a heretic today, where when you hear advanced practice nurses talk about what they want to achieve, it's too often about their professional positioning and what they get to be allowed to do, whether they get MBS items and other things, whereas the conversation needs to be framed around what is it that is the gap in the clinical care of patients and how a nurse is placed to fill it. And I keep thinking about the subsidiarity principle, which Miles Prince used to talk about when he established the first nurse practitioner in haematology role at Peter Mac, which was about developing a system that says you've got somebody like Miles Prince who should be doing the things that Miles Prince is best capable of doing, and he shouldn't be doing the things that another person can do, and sort of role shifting over time as things become routinized, then we should be doing that in order to make the system more accessible. So
I think it is too compartmentalized, isn't it? And the nurse practitioner roles, I think there's a real need for them, but they're sort of all individually designed. I think there needs to be kind of like a generic role as well. And it's like, here's the role that we all need in our cancer unit, and who's got the skills to do it. And if you don't, let's have a training program. But I think there's this kind of like individual, and as you say, it's sort of focused on what they can and can't do at an individual level. And I get frustrated at times, we should all be working at the top of our scope. And you get a message or a phone call about, it's like, oh my God, why am I getting called about that?
Well, I remember when I first learnt to do venipunctures to be able to give IV medication, it was in Invercargill, and nurses weren't allowed to do that. But we looked after the senior pathologist who was dying of bowel cancer, and it was back before I knew anything about pain medication, so forgive me, palliative care people. But we were giving him IV morphine, but he was so confused, he was pulling out all the IVs, and so we had to put little, butterflies in to give him the IV drugs. And we learnt to do it so that the resident didn't have to get out of bed in the middle of the night. So, but actually we were better positioned to do it, and it took a long time after that for it to be routine.
All right. So thank you, Professor. We could call you nurse professor, researcher, influencer, heretic. It's been a fascinating half hour or so talking about your illustrious career. I hope it does inspire others, nurses and non-nurses, to really grasp those opportunities and try and make systems change, addressing equity for everyone. It's been fantastic. Is there anything that you think that we should have touched on that we haven't done?
No,
Sanchia?
I think that's been great. I think it's a great conversation. It's good to always reflect back on your life. Hopefully I'm not at the end of it yet.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. No, thank you. And we'll reference some of these great papers that you sent. So thanks very much, Sanchia. Looking forward to seeing you in another forum or meetings soon.
You too, Craig.
You've been listening to the Oncology Podcast. If you enjoyed today's edition and would like to subscribe, head over to our website, oncologynews.com.au, and sign up to our newsletter. Thanks for listening.